right, well, let's get started. Other attendees may be joining us, but it's a little past 4. Um, Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar, Climate Change and the Future of the Planet. We're delighted that you've joined us today. My name is Deborah Mutnick. I teach in the English department at Long Island University's Brooklyn campus, and I'm one of 5 co-directors of the Campus Community Urban Sustainability Program, CUSP, together with biology professors Tim Leslie and Carol Griffiths and philosophy professor Margaret Kwanzo. The 5th member of our team, Jay Shuttleworth, is an assistant professor of education at CUNY Queens College. CUSP aims to develop curricula on urban sustainability across the curriculum and to work with students, colleagues, and community members to understand and contribute to solving the environmental and ecological problems of our times. We're grateful for the support of Long Island University and a generous grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Our first virtual forum at the end of February on food justice featured urban farmer and activist Karen Washington and Lena Puerta, an artist. Our second was with environmental health scientist Anjali Sawtoff on urban health in the time of COVID. Our last forum in the series today is Climate Change and the Future of the Planet with climate impact scientist Cynthia Rosenzweig. All the forums are being recorded and will be available on YouTube. Unfortunately, Dr. Rosenzweig is currently in London and will not be with us in person due to the time difference. However, she has provided us with a wonderful recorded talk, and her assistant, Maria Dumbrov, will be joining us for the Q&A. Just a few notes about how to participate in today's webinar. You can see the presenters, but the presenters cannot see you. You may comment in the chat box, but please ask questions in the Q&A. You can see the icon at the bottom of the screen and ask your questions there. Dr. Carol Griffiths will introduce Dr. Rosenzweig, and she and Dr. Tim Leslie will lead the Q&A. They will engage in a dialogue with Maria Dumbrov in response to the presentation, along with Q&A from the audience. It is now my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Carol Griffiths, recently retired professor of biology at LIU Brooklyn and member of the CUSP project team. Please welcome Dr. Griffiths.
Thank you, Deborah. I am thrilled to be here, and I'm thrilled that we have Cynthia Rosenzweig, even though virtually, to present. So Dr. Rosenzweig, her introduction is just huge. She is just amazing. She's a senior research scientist at NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies, an adjunct senior research scientist at the Columbia University Earth Institute, and a professor in the Department of Environmental Science at Barnard College. At NASA's Goddard Institute, she heads the Climate Impacts Group, whose mission is to investigate the interactions of climate on systems and sectors important to human well-being. In addition, she is co-director of the Urban Climate Change Research Network, UCCRN, and co-editor of their assessment reports on climate change and cities. She was co-chair of the New York City panel on climate change and co-led the Metropolitan East Coast Regional Assessment of the U.S. National Assessment of the Potential Consequences of Climate Variability and Change. Finally, she is co-founder and a member of the Executive Committee of the Agricultural Model Intercomparison and Improvement Project and coordinating lead author of the Food Security Chapter for the IPCC's Special Report on Climate Change and Land. Okay, I think we are ready now for the video.
Great.
Hello, I'm Dr. Cynthia Rosenzweig. I'm a senior research scientist at NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies, and I'm so happy to speak with you today at the Earth Day program for the Campus and Community Urban Sustainability Program at Long Island University. I want to start with Walt Whitman, because while we're celebrating Earth Day 2021, Walt Whitman's words remind us about the beauty of the earth and the appreciation of the earth, which has been going on for a long time. So in 1855, Walt Whitman said, "Have you reckoned 1,000 acres much? Have you reckoned the earth much? Stop this day and night with me, and you shall possess the origin of all poems. You shall possess the good of the earth and the sun." So that's thoughts for Earth Day from perhaps the greatest poet ever in America. He loved New York, and that's so. Now to go to what you see on the screen, that in his poem from 1867 called Mannahatta, this is what he says about New York: "The beautiful city, the city of hurried and sparkling waters, the city nested in bays." So I wanted to start with the poetry of the earth. Next, I want to go to what's happening right now, yesterday and today, for Earth Day 2021 in Washington, D.C. The Climate Ambition Summit that has been convened by President Biden. Many of you are probably watching it yesterday with 40 world leaders, many of them upping their targets, upping their commitments to lower greenhouse gas emissions in their countries. Today, Bill Gates and other corporate leaders and other business leaders are making their commitments as well. Up at the top, you see how to get there. This is the slide about it that is on the Climate U website, climateu.org website. So now I'm going to launch into the role of cities, because you are an urban group, and one of the things that I've worked on for a long time is that I realized long ago that cities were in some ways the key to responding to climate change. So we founded a network called the Urban Climate Change Research Network, UCERN, and the mission of this network is to develop co-generated knowledge that enables cities. And by the way, when I say cities, I don't just mean, for example, the 5 boroughs of Manhattan. I mean the entire metropolitan regions. And the focus also is in some ways spreading out and expanding. So we're not just thinking about climate change and what's happening at City Hall. Of course, that's very important. But what's happening in the suburban areas and on the surrounding metropolitan regions, such as Long Island for New York City. So this network, the mission is to develop co-generated knowledge that enables cities to fulfill their climate change leadership potential in both mitigation, reduction of greenhouse gases, and adaptation, developing resilience to climate extremes. There are over 1,200 scientists, scholars, and expert practitioners across all areas of climate change in cities, and that's pretty much everything. There are more than 150 cities around the world that take part, and it was founded in 2007. So we're not new kids on the block anymore, and it's a wonderful network. And we're going to be later on, I'm going to invite you to have a special role. So what is it that we do in this network? One of our main activities is to create these big assessments of everything. It's like everything climate change in cities. So the first one was in 2011. That's the pink and orange one. 4-year effort, 100 authors, 50 plus cities. The second one was 2017, 350 plus authors, over 100 cities. There were 16 chapters, 115 case studies. Now we have just started the third assessment report. You see it there, which is going to be published 2021 to 2023. And it's now in progress. By the way, we also, during COP 21, 2015 in Paris, we launched the summary for city leaders, because now the nation states that came together to sign the Paris Agreement realized that cities have a very crucial role to play in climate action. So we were part of the climate summit in Paris in 2015 as well. The cities were there, not just the countries. And we are very interested in developing case study authors and case studies for the new one of city actions. So perhaps we could develop a case study about your program on urban sustainability. And so we'll be in touch about creating that. The main part of my talk today is about the 5 pathways to urban transformation. And I know this is Earth Day and we're thinking about the whole Earth. And so these are also probably the 5 pathways to transformation for climate change. But because we're focused on the role of the cities, these are the 5 pathways to urban transformation. And we're going to go through them. It's kind of follow the yellow brick road to the green city. The first one is mitigation and adaptation. Second one is about disaster risks and extremes and climate change adaptation. Third one is about co-generation of risk information. How do we actually create the knowledge that's needed? The fourth one, crucially important, is identifying the needs of disadvantaged populations. All cities have disadvantaged populations. They need to be a primary, if not the primary focus of climate action. And establish and advance knowledge networks. That's what universities are and what our user network is as well. So we're going to just very quickly look at the 5 pathways. The first one is integrate mitigation and adaptation. So often we think about these separately. They're in sort of silos, okay, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, developing climate resilience. But actually in cities where everything is pretty intertwined, actions that reduce greenhouse gas emissions while increasing resilience are a win-win. So on the left here, you see a wonderful project in Helsinki in Finland that is, it's called the Helsinki Smart City. You see that it's by the Baltic Sea, so it has to be all resilient to coastal flooding with sea level rise, but at the same time, it is a district heating and cooling system so that it is greatly reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So urban planning, design, and architecture, very key here as we work to integrate mitigation and adaptation. On the right, you see the role of I have to, because I'm a NASA scientist, I always show something with remote sensing, one of the great NASA tools. And here, remote sensing allows us to monitor changes in air pollution and track the progress towards zero carbon goals. In this case, it's looking at NO2 as an air pollutant. And one of the things we do in NASA is work on both air pollution and climate change at the same time. This is very critical in cities. So that's pathway number 1. Pathway number 2 is to coordinate disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. This is the 2 timeframes, integration of 2 timeframes. The disaster risk reduction is extreme events that happen right away, right now. And in our case, and in many cases, these the frequency of the extreme events are increasing. At the same time, we have long-term climate changes that we need to adapt to and become resilient to. Things like just warmer temperatures in general, saltwater intrusion into water supplies. These are long-term things that we have to be dealing with as well. again, there used to be two communities. Here's the we call it DRR folks. Here's the climate change adaptation folks. Now we're bringing them, those communities are coming together. And these really are this integration of the two timeframes of responding to the two timeframes in cities is really the cornerstone of resilience. And this is by one of our network members, Samaya Ali Ibrahim, on right after Hurricane Sandy in 2012 in Staten Island. You can see the devastation there. Pathway 3 is about how we generate knowledge. And we call it co-generation. What this means is that risk assessments and climate change action plans co-generated with stakeholders and scientists. So the stakeholders are people who are actually going to use the knowledge, who actually need the knowledge to make decisions. And the scientists have the work on the knowledge foundation. Together is how we need to go forward from now on to actually develop the resilience programs that we need. So how do we do this? So if you can see behind the turquoise screen, you see the Urban Design Climate Workshop in Durban, South Africa, with stakeholders. And we hold workshops in which we hear from the stakeholders, well, this is an area that is flooded, for example, very frequently. This is what we're doing now. Some of it is working, some of it is not. What can we do to do better? How can we think about a neighborhood in totality? This is probably what you're doing in part with your sustainable campus. So these workshops focus on improving climate resiliency, reducing energy consumption. Remember about combining mitigation and adaptation at the same time, and enhancing quality of life. It all has to make quality of life better so that we can really go forward to the transformation that's needed for climate change. Relevance, flexibility, legitimacy of climate change programs are essential. Pathway 4 is, I think we should probably renumber these and put this one first, focused on disadvantaged populations. The needs of the most disadvantaged and vulnerable citizens should always be addressed in climate change planning and action. So the left is work that was done as part of the New York Standalone Climate Change by the community-based adaptation team and working with community-based activist groups. And they calculated the social vulnerability to climate change across the neighborhoods and census tracts. The vulnerability, as we all know, to climate change in New York City varies across social groups, economic levels, and neighborhoods. It is not equal across the whole city, and this must always be taken into account so that this can aid in the targeting of adaptation resources. This is absolutely critical. And you don't want to do harm. If you're thinking, oh, this might be a great thing to do, but what if it disadvantages groups even more? So always this has to be absolutely front and center in all planning and implementation for climate change. Finally, Pathway 5. We're almost to the transformed urban city. We're almost to the end of our yellow brick road for climate change. This has to do with, this is a bit of a grab bag pathway. First of all, advancing finance. Look, it costs money to do these things. But we have to figure out how we're going to finance mechanisms. For example, how are we going to finance putting electric car chargers all across the city? How's that going to actually happen? So, and then how are we going to finance development of those neighborhoods, for example, as in Helsinki, that are resilient to sea level rise, but at the same time doing distributed heat and power. So we need to advance finance for climate change. We need to, in order to get good finance, you have to have good governance, right? So governance structures need to be expanded, flexible, targeted, so that these processes for climate change mitigation and adaptation can be implemented by the governments. Of course, government's not the only player here. And as we were hearing at the climate summit today, businesses and corporations, of course, and the private sector, of course, have a huge role to play, because governments alone can't do it. And then the knowledge networks. I want to share what this slide is showing, just one part of the knowledge part that I think is very, very important, which is indicators and monitoring. And I think this is an important role for universities and students and professors and researchers, is to create indicator and monitoring systems that can be tracking what's happening with the climate. The climate is changing. How much warmer is it getting? How much is the sea level rise advancing? What's happening with our coastal flooding, our nuisance flooding, for example, and the impacts. So what's happening in terms of heat mortality effects during heat waves? That's on the indicator. So we need indicators for climate, indicators for impacts. Then the vulnerability indicators that we were looking at in the map, very, very critically important. How are those changing over time? And then finally, resilience. So let's say we do a program in which we are creating a sustainable neighborhood in a coastal region, in the New York metropolitan region. I think this is very crucial for Long Island, right? So then how do we, for example, what we need to do is be sure we evaluate it and track it. What's the baseline of how often it floods, and what's the damage when that neighborhood floods? And then once we implement, let's say we're implementing greenways to absorb floodwaters, for example. Well, is it reducing damage? So these indicators and monitoring are really important knowledge network, and I think an important role for researchers and students. Many great student projects on what we call NYCLIM, New York Climate Indicators and Monitoring System. So what we did, so you have the 5 pathways. So how do we judge to see, how do we sort of see, how do we see how a city is doing? So we developed, Bill Selecki and I, we were co-leaders of the New York City Panel on Climate Change for 10 years. And we created these spider diagrams for analyzing self-reporting, so that city folks, or you could use these, for example, for your program. Well, how are things going in terms of what you are implementing? And for each one, you do a level of how are you doing how is this program or this city area or city neighborhood integrating mitigation and adaptation, coordinating disaster risk and climate change adaptation, co-generating risk information. Are you getting with stakeholders? Are you focused on disadvantaged populations? And are you advancing governance, finance, and knowledge networks? So we find that this is it's a useful, to get a way to think about all this very, very complex processes that climate change really entail, of course, to implement resilience and mitigation. But this is like a simple way to see, well, to get an answer to the question, how are we doing? So want to share with you just now, as we're coming to the end, the third assessment report that's just getting going. We just had the kickoff workshop with about 125 researchers from cities all over the world. It was very exciting. And we're doing 12 special reports, and then we're going to combine them. And these are the topics. I won't go through them all, but you can see it's soup to nuts on climate change and cities. from architecture, urban planning and design that we mentioned. Of course, we have to look at COVID-19, cities and climate change. I'm going to be coming to that very shortly. Here's finance, equity, development, governance. These are some of the things we were just saying about the transformations. But at the same time, what's happening with infrastructure systems that are like this heart, the kind of like the heart, the pulsing heart of the city that cities can't work without. But what's the role then of circular economies, technology, nature-based solutions coming very much to the fore, so that there's use of vegetation throughout the city in a much expanded way. And then, of course, how are we really going to change? We need the psychologists, right? Perception, communication specialists. How is this really going to all work? That we're going to be transforming our society as we must do in the coming decades to respond to climate change. We need psychologists and behavior specialists and communication specialists to tell us about perception, communication, and behavior. So I said about just coming to the end now, just to say that we've just really come to the end, we hope and pray, of our COVID, of our intense period of the coronavirus pandemic. And what we have been doing is a research project. One of the things we've been doing is a research project that looks at both COVID-19 and climate stresses at the same time, the compound risks of them. Because, for example, some of the interventions for COVID-19, like going outside, right, which we all know now is safer, but at the same time, if the streets are very hot, elderly people can get too hot and can get heat stress for that. So with city stakeholders, we developed a project in which we were looking at these risks at the same time. So we have a heat part and we have a coastal flooding part, because I don't know if you remember, but right in the middle of last summer, I think it was in August, we had a hurricane, Isaias. And this was happening at this very same time as we were dealing with Corona. So through looking at census tract data, we look to see what are the overlays of these stresses. And just to say that there are 75 neighborhoods in New York City affected both by high rates of COVID cases. We look to see where COVID cases were most severe, sea level rise, and they are lower in the evacuation priority zones. So these people may have maybe more at risk given the compound stresses of COVID and coastal flooding. So that is, as we go forward, also just one more thing about COVID. As we come out of COVID, it's really important that we don't just go back all the way to our greenhouse gas emitting way of life. So it's a time for, I think, everybody and the society and our cities to think about what can we do to make our COVID recovery climate friendly as well. So with that, I would like to conclude by sharing that UCERN, wait a second, here we go. UCERN and ARC 3.3 are in full swing. We very much want, anyone who is interested, we would love for you to be case study authors. We'll get with your program, with LAU CUSP program to see if we can have one for all the great work you are doing. The co-generation with stakeholders is more essential than ever as we really get going. It won't work if it's just scientists throwing things over the fence. I think this integration of mitigation and adaptation are intertwined in cities. We've got to begin to think about these things in a more holistic and integrated way. And finally, as COVID-19 and the pandemic recedes, as I said, we hope and pray, climate change needs to be part of the recovery. We cannot separate the two responding to to global systemic risks, coming out of the acute risk of COVID, but becoming more and more aware, as we see at President Biden's Climate Ambition Summit yesterday and today, that climate change is now part of the recovery in every way. Thank you so much. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person to give a Zoom presentation in person. I'm in London, actually seeing family after more than a year. But I wish you well in all the great things that you're doing. Thank you very much.
But we're lucky to have Maria Dombrov, who is a colleague of hers. And so Maria is the program coordinator of the Urban Climate Change Research Network, UCERN for short. She is also lead coordinator for the third assessment report on climate change in cities, which you just heard mentioned, that ARC 3.3. Maria works very closely with Dr. Cynthia Rosenzweig and the Climate Impacts Group as a research staff assistant. So welcome, Maria. Thank you so much for joining us on short notice. Anybody that missed the introduction, I'm Tim Leslie from the Department of Biology here at LIU Brooklyn, and a co-director of our campus sustainability program, as is my colleague, Dr. Griffiths, who's a professor in biology as well, and also part of CUSP. So I think before we get into a discussion, Maria offered to maybe share a few more slides on the network, the program she works in, and then we can move on to a discussion from there.
Hi, everyone. Firstly, I'd like to thank LIU Campus Community Urban Sustainability Program for inviting Cynthia and myself. It's a great pleasure to be here today, and I'm just going to share my screen. So if you guys have any questions regarding Cynthia's presentation, please feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A specifically, or you can reach out to us at the following email addresses right here, and I'll just wait a second in case anyone wants to screenshot that. But also I can make these PowerPoints available for you guys if you'd like. So I just wanted to go into, oh, sorry, Deborah, did you get that? I noticed that you're taking a photo. Okay. I just wanted to go a little further into the Urban Climate Change Research Network, which is UCERN, or UCCRN for short. My phone is ringing, so I'm going to turn that off. The quirks of working at home. So the Urban Climate Change Research Network is a group of roughly 1,200 individuals, scientists, scholars, city practitioners, and we're in roughly 150 cities and all around the world. We were founded in 2007. So here's more about our regional hub. So as you see on the right, we're focused globally. Our UCERN Secretariat is in New York, but we have many hub directors and hub networks throughout the world. And the purpose of this is to engage at the regional level, to have scientists and city practitioners at the regional level throughout the world in order to share knowledge with each other and to develop relationships with regional researchers as a way to build knowledge partnerships with cities. So just putting faces to some names, we have the UCERN Secretariat here. There's Cynthia and there's Bill Selecki, the co-directors of the network. And we work closely with Franco Montalto, who is our New York North American Hub Director, as well as Juan Camilo Osorio, who is our Latin America Hub Director. But we talk to these folks on a monthly basis. So running a network involves collaborating with everyone worldwide on a monthly basis. And this is one specific thing that I thought would be useful for all of you today. So this is the ARC3 case study docking station, which is an online searchable open source database. And we have, I think, roughly 115 case studies, which you see the little dots on the screen. So we have case studies in each of these regions throughout the world. And this was a recently developed partnership with MIT Environmental Solutions Initiative. And I'll just take a moment in case you guys want to take a photo of this as well, to access our case study docking station, which has environmental stresses such as coastal flooding. There's there's quite a wide variety of topics on this database. And if you just want to stay connected with us, here's our website. We update it quite frequently, and we have a social media as well. So we're on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at UCERN. And here I just thought that putting all of the campus community urban sustainability program topics together, I thought I would talk a little bit about cities, incorporating equity and food systems. So this is just to get us thinking as we open up into our discussion and question and answer sections. So I'll stop sharing my screen and we can continue on with today's webinar.
Thanks so much, Maria. Interesting. One quick note about your slides. Those case studies, are those geared towards policymakers, or is that more towards for education, like our students?
Yeah, I would say they're mostly for students and educational purposes, but we engaged with a variety amount of people, city practitioners and policymakers included. We have policymakers on all of our reports. So ARC 3.1, ARC 3.2, and ARC 3.3, which is forthcoming. Yeah, so there's a wide variety of folks.
So I have a question
Participants
about
the, students. I'm just wondering if you could just briefly talk about your academic pathway to get where you are right now, because you have such an interesting and I'm sure fulfilling job. How could a student envision their pathway to get where you are at this point?
Sure. So I am an early career research scientist. I have a bachelor's degree in biology, which is funny enough that both of you guys are professors in biology. So I focused on biology and environmental science in my bachelor's degree at Syracuse University. I took a year off and then I went into climate and society program at Columbia University, which is a master's program. So I did that for a full intensive 12 months. And then I found myself at the Climate Impacts Group based in New York City. And since then I've went on to coordinate for the Urban Climate Change Research Network and be involved in quite a few different projects, both research and some science communications activities as well. So that's a little bit about the brief overview of where I've gotten to where I am currently.
Very nice.
So I have a question about outreach. And so I'm an academic, or retired academic, but I've also done a lot of work with community groups. And it seems to me that that is one of the things that might be missing in your collaboration is that kind of outreach, because you can get policymakers to make changes, but unless you have the political will to support those changes by the voters, they're not going to work. So I'm wondering if you have any plans, if your group has any plans to outreach to different kinds of community groups, environmental organizations, that kind of thing.
Yeah, we do engage with a bunch of different organizations on our current project, the COVID and Climate Stresses Project, which Cynthia was talking about towards the end of the slide. So we have participants from Columbia, MIT, as well as City Tech and CUNY institutions, also Pratt. So there's a variety of folks involved in that research consortium. And we try to also interact with NYC policymakers and stakeholders as well. As far as outreach goes, we do have a global focus, but we do have regional hub directors as well. So we do intend on engaging in outreach events and activities of that nature.
Okay.
Do you find, speaking to people that aren't working in scientific fields, that there's more receptivity to the idea of climate change, that there's less skepticism? I know we were chatting before we came online here a little bit, how there's often this divide between the scientific community and the general public on a variety of topics. And I know there are efforts being made to have scientists be better communicators. And I don't know if you had any thoughts on that, whether it's incumbent upon us to communicate ideas better, or whether it's has to come from the bottom up, from science education from a young age, or any ideas on that, or how it's moving as far as climate change skepticism is concerned.
Yeah, science communications is a hot topic at the moment. I myself am in science communications, so I interact with web development and the social media platforms. And I think, you know, the scientists, they're very focused on the scientific data itself, and it's an extremely useful tool. But if the scientists aren't able to communicate what they're saying in layman's terms and in a very approachable manner, I think there can sometimes be disconnects. In our ARC3 reports, we aim to have accessible wording of our reports so that it is accessible to policymakers and students. And we do engage people throughout their career journey. So we have both established professionals as well as scientists and early career scholars as well. So we engage people throughout their careers in order to try to combat some of these science communications issues that we're facing in this day and age.
You make a good point that we're often so data driven and fact driven and evidence driven. And I actually worked on an independent study with a student who wasn't in biology, but they were in psychology, to like investigate this perception gap. And one of the things, you know, she reported on was this phenomenon of a backfire effect, and that when you try to change somebody's mind by just pushing evidence and data, they tend to dig in even more and be less receptive to change. And evidence suggests that maybe the best way to change somebody's mind is to appeal to them emotionally, on an emotional level. And so I'm thinking of climate change as a topic. Maybe the idea there is, you know, artful storytelling of some sort. And I'm just thinking right now, you know, with this CUSP program, the idea of it was to bridge the humanities and the sciences, you know, bringing that type of collaboration in where we tell stories to convey scientific topics could be very helpful in changing hearts and minds on a variety of topics.
We do have a question from one of the attendees, and that is, what are some of the most effective measures that can be implemented or have been thus far to address disadvantaged groups in light of climate challenge? And she also thanks for the presentation. So Maria, do you have any information about that?
Sure, I can take an initial thought on it. I'm just going to reread the question. Yeah, so in our research, this is an interesting topic that's coming to light recently. And I'll never forget when working on the science and time of the coronavirus project, where one scientist said, well, it seems that everyone stops doing their science once it gets to looking at socioeconomic variables and redlining and things that are directly data targeted towards disadvantaged groups. So I think incorporating data sets that account for these individuals and these groups and these communities who are potentially disadvantaged, I think that's a very important thing that shouldn't be overlooked in our research, and incorporating this research into communication that's effective and accessible.
So I could just interject something here. So I'm with a group called Federated Conservationists of Westchester, and we have a grant to work with the city of Mount Vernon, which is an environmental justice city. And we are trying to work with them to get the people who live there empowered. And it's difficult. I mean, there's not an easy answer to this, but one of the things we've done is try to find out what their problems are now, get in touch with any of the community leaders, and then working with addressing their problems, getting them involved in communicating their problems to the policymakers. So we're trying to help with that. And one of the things that we've done is take a walk. We've, in fact, Anjali Sothop, who had given the second talk, conducted a walk through one of the communities and got a lot of community people there to look around to see, okay, what does this look like? What do I want to change? How does this affect me? How do I perceive my community? And that way to get responses from the residents. And this also kind of leads into a second question. So where is the public in all of this? This is one of the second question. I hear scientists, students, policymakers, not the folks you meet on the street. Many of them are the disadvantages you want to serve. So I guess that's another question about how you connect the policymakers, the academics, the people doing research to the people on the street. And I'm not sure whether, I know you've answered that partially, Maria, but is there anything more that you can say about that?
Sure, I would say that sometimes it's challenging to engage in the public when scientists' main priority is to be data driven and to answer the climate change questions at hand. We do have some case studies that we're working on, Bedford-Stuyvesant community in Brooklyn, which we do focus on engaging with the public. And we do this through answering and distributing online surveys where the public community members can comment their concerns and they can answer questions that will go directly into our scientific process that do incorporate the public. Yes, this is very small scale and this is one example, but if we use this example for scientists located in many different areas, we could start tackling public concerns on more regional scales. So that's one way I would answer that.
Right, and
Even though no one likes filling out 20-minute surveys.
But the idea of surveys and boots on the ground, interacting directly with the community, even if while you're conducting science, is a good point. I've done past research in community gardens, and it included some survey type data, different than the normal type of data we may collect on, what are the primary problems you deal with regarding pests, right, or soil conditions, and you use those surveys to sort of gear the direction of the research to better serve the communities in your neighborhood, right? And I would also point out that the forum we're conducting today is a good vehicle to bridge that gap between campus and communities, where we can have discussions like this.
So we have a couple more questions.
Q&A.
I'm sorry. So Nancy asks, can you give an example of something you are working on right now in New York City? For example, are you involved at all in the threatened development of the Graniteville wetlands on Staten Island? And if yes, how are you interacting with the community, scientists, etc.?
Yeah, so our group doesn't specifically focus on the Graniteville wetlands, although we have some other focuses within wetlands in the New York City and Five Borough area. The New York City project that we're working on currently is the COVID and Climate Stresses Project, and there's three main topics within that project. One's coastal flooding, another is heat vulnerability, and another is air pollution.
Okay. So one more question. Can you say a little more about the case studies in your project? And you also said something about, I'm sorry, you also said something about maybe getting some students involved in case studies. Maybe you can also elaborate on that part of it too.
Yeah, we would love to have everyone on this call engaging in case studies for ARC 3.3. So the 12 topics that Cynthia mentioned in the previous presentation are the main topics that will be focused on in terms of case study topics. So they focus generally at the local scale. So you would focus in a city of your choosing and choose a topic that targets that specific city in terms of climate impacts.
Okay. Another question, most discussions on climate change is focused on cities, both in terms of how they negatively impact the environment and steps they are taking to address it. However, this woman would like to learn more about impacts on the environment of suburban or rural areas, in particular of agriculture. And she's also curious across industries. That's a broad question.
So we focus on cities. It's because roughly half of the global population lives in cities, and it's projected to increase to 2/3 of the global population by 2050. So that's generally why we have such a large focus in cities, is because there are so many people living there and everything's interconnected. We focus in systems. So if you think about an urban scale system, it often also incorporates the metropolitan region and some of the suburban areas as well. And of course, who's supplying our food? It's the rural areas.
Yeah, we can think climate change affecting agriculture in numerous ways, right? Whether you can think even from pest pressure, that the insect populations will grow much more quickly, pathogens, disease, and then also just some crop growing regions due to changing temperatures or climatic conditions can become sort of obsolete for growing certain types of crops. And you know, a farmer just can't up and move somewhere else, right, to grow their crop if they're not able to do it anymore. One note going back to cities, I was reading, I believe it was one of the ARC reports, the previous one. So you're currently working on I guess the third one.
Yes.
And I was reading the forwards, which I found interesting because it looks like you invited different mayors of major cities around the world to just provide a few thoughts. And almost all of them touched on the idea that cities need to carry out both mitigation and adaptation. And so from Cynthia's talk, she mentioned mitigation is actually reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Adaptation seems to me more just recognizing the fact that, you know, we reached a point where there are going to be changes and we have to put policies or conditions in place that will allow us to be more resilient and adapt to a more uncertain future. And when I'm thinking about these adaptations that cities can take on, they could either be technological or physical infrastructure, or they could be ecological. I think Cynthia mentioned nature-based. And I just wondered, in your opinion, I'm thinking of New York City as an example. I remember reading a story a year ago that they were considering putting in a giant retractable seawall under the Verrazano Bridge to literally keep the ocean out. And but then on the other side of the spectrum, you have them, you know, introducing saltwater marshes in Gateway National Park. And in your experience, is there more of an emphasis on the ecological, adaptation approach, which I think, in my opinion, long term would be more sustainable than building giant walls to hold out the ocean?
Yeah, I would say that's something that the engineers tend to talk about. They always want to build things and put things up in the city. And sometimes we've heard these projects come up where they have these great ideas, but sometimes they don't really do anything, or they just redistribute, for example, the seawater to a different location. So therefore protecting New York, but what about New Jersey? So I have a caution against some of these projects, but I mean, ultimately, yes, there is a focus on adaptation, but without reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, you know, where will we be? We'll still be headed towards a warmer climate. And I did pull some of the New York City and New York State goals for carbon neutrality. So NYC aims to be carbon neutral by 2050, whereas New York State has a less cautious reductions by 85% by 2050. So we're heading in the right direction in terms of mitigation. It's just a matter of getting it done and doing it so that it's actually good for the long term.
Okay, there's another question about if it's possible for you to comment on urban gardening and farming in relation to climate change. Are you working on this connection at all in your research?
I don't specifically focus on urban gardening. I do some of the agricultural research within our group. It's mostly graphic design and fixing figures and things of that nature. Cynthia, that would probably be a question for Cynthia to answer. She's the agronomist, so I can put her email in the chat again.
Okay, that would be good. And I think we should emphasize to people that she is really open to answering questions. So if you have questions, Maria, if you do put her email in the chat, that would be really helpful to a lot of the people who are attending this.
Of course.
Our location in LIU Brooklyn, right in downtown Brooklyn, is an interesting spot as far as just urban farming. Jogged my memory here that one of the largest rooftop farms in the world is actually just a few blocks away, the Brooklyn Grange. And so part of our sustainability classes that we've developed as part of CUSP will actually even take students on field trips there to tour these rooftop farms, which, as we know, are multifunctional too, right? Because they can aid with reducing the heat island effect, absorbing rainwater, all these different benefits beyond just growing local food. So it'd be really nice to see that area grow, this urban farming. So that was a good question as well.
I don't see any more questions. Anybody else have questions? Anybody else who are attending, any questions at all? So we can get going with that. And if not, Tim, anything else that you want to say?
Just out of personal interest, on the wonky side, we like to read these the International Climate Panel reports, your ARC report. I was looking over that before, and there are hundreds of pages long, hundreds of authors. Our group is currently working on a book just with 20 people, which is hard enough. How do you, and it says you're the coordinator for this moving forward, how do you wrangle all those people and put this together? Like, can you give us behind the scenes a little bit? Are you meeting monthly or?
Yeah, so I meet with various hub directors and the editorial board and our co-directors, anywhere from weekly to bi-weekly. It's constant communication is involved in wrangling the whole group. Lots of emailing and lots of just constant updates in Excel documents. But it is possible, and it's for the greater good. And we aim that our next report will be short, focused, and timely. So our reports will be much smaller, hopefully much more digestible information. So we're trying to be with the times and adapt in a way that's good for the world and good for decision makers.
Okay, I'd like you to go back about the case studies. So you had asked if people would get involved in, students getting involved in case studies. Can you give us an example of like one possible case study, and how do you do it? Who do you contact you? How do we get involved with case studies?
Yeah, so you can contact me directly. I was actually just going to write that in the chat. So if you want to be involved in a case study directly targeted at the topics. So for example, our first 6 topics that we're working on are COVID and climate stresses, equity, development and informality, urban climate science, architecture, urban planning and design, governance, enabling policy, environments and just transitions, and finance and climate action. So those are some of the examples of case studies that you could be involved in, and you could direct them towards where your hometown is or where your local environment is, where, close to Long Island University, or in the New York City area, whatever suits you and whatever you feel is within your realm of expertise.
Is there a list? Can you send a list or put a list in of all 12 of the possible case studies, topics?
Sure.
That you mentioned? That would be great. Okay, another question. I have a farm garden on my residential townhouse roof in Central Brooklyn. And would be happy to give anyone a tour if interested. That's not exactly a question, but okay.
Nice.
And another question, the link to the database of articles in the chat, and then can you please expand on the second one? I guess the second topic.
On the second one, I believe that was equity, development, and informality.
Yes.
Can anyone confirm? Yeah, so this is just getting going. This, as Cynthia mentioned, our workshop was last week with around 150 participants. So the reports themselves, or the outlines, are still being developed for them. This will have a global focus, so there will be authors from various parts of the world, New York, as well as North America, as well as Africa and Asia. The co-shepherd for our equity element is Sean O'Donoghue, and he's based in Durban, South Africa. And so he will be guiding the chapter in its development.
Can you give us a little bit more detail about what the chapter will consist of? I mean, you know, it's a very broad topic, so maybe just 1 or 2 examples of something that would be part of that chapter.
Sure, I would say that in terms of the informality, we'll be targeting we'll be targeting topics of informal human settlements, equity and environmental justice, development in terms of making sure that we develop our climate agendas with a focus on underserved communities. So those are a few examples.
Okay.
And I can actually share the full list.
That would be great.
Here. So this is the full list of 12.
Okay. And if somebody wanted to do a case study based on any of those, would there be, say, urban climate science or perception, communication, and behavior? Would there be more information? Is there a website where we could look at any of those 12 things and just get a little more information about them?
Yeah, so I have it's not available on our website at the moment. I do have the extended prospectus, which has descriptions on each of the 12 above, which I would be able to share with you through email.
Okay, that would be great. And then we could share that with anybody who's interested in that.
Okay, I don't see anything else in the Q&A. Maybe just one interesting question here at the end. In light of the news coming out that it looks like the US has these new targets that are pretty ambitious, and you being someone that's on the front lines with policy and research, do you find yourself becoming more hopeful with each day or each year, or less hopeful that we're going to adequately address this crisis?
Yeah, I would say I'm an optimist with a sprinkle of realism or a lot of realism. I think resilience and city resilience is attainable, and it's possible when including decision-making processes, collaborating with local governments and stakeholders and local community members. So I think really delving into the heart of the issue and trying to get everyone on board and get everyone's perspective is how we're going to actually solve the climate crisis.
Okay.
I'm happy to get your thoughts as well, Carolyn, too.
Well, just from working with, we did an environmental justice conference for Westchester County. I know it seems like it's a really rich county, but there's a lot of environmental justice communities. And for the people from those communities who attended and who were part of the panels, this was the first time that people were listening to them. And so, and one of the problems is when you work with a community like that is that you don't want to go in and talk to them. You want to listen to them. And so that's just a hard thing to get people to understand they have a voice, and to get them to understand that we can maybe help them expand their voice and get something done. And I think that's maybe an important part of the environmental movement now, is to do this kind of outreach to the people who have not been saying anything before. And I know the research is extremely important, and I don't know that academics who are doing research in this field have the time to be able to then do this kind of outreach. So I think we'd really have to have it would be great if academics could get credit for doing outreach, not just research, because I think if we're going to solve climate change and we're going to mitigate it and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we have to get people invested in it. Anyway, that's it. Okay, I'm not sure. Tim, anything else? What do you think?
I would say that I agree that I like the comment being an optimist. while a realist at the same time. I think one thing to think about is that it's very hard to predict the future as far as technological advancements too. Right? Now we see these, you can think of like a lot of greenhouse gases come from meat production. And so who knows, maybe in 10 or 20 years, we'll have cultured meat from a laboratory, and you know, traditional livestock will be obsolete, and we could turn those farms into prairie lands or something that would sequester carbon. So I tend to be positive, but I don't think, like you mentioned, Carol, that technology or innovation will solve everything. It's going to have to come from the ground up too, from listening to communities and action.
Right, right.
Well, if we don't have any other questions, I would just, I want to thank Maria for participating today, especially on short notice for this webinar. And we want to thank Cynthia as well for a wonderful presentation. Carol, I don't know if you have any other final comments. I do know that these will be available online, correct? As Deborah, I think, said that'll be available. And we hope to possibly have a fall sustainability series as well, with a series of webinars where the public can join in and listen in just as today. Okay, so thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Maria.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you, Maria. Thanks, Carol.
We will be in touch.